Good afternoon and welcome to today's public lecture by Dr. Vivian Howard. After earning her BA and MA at the University of British Columbia, Dr. Howard completed an MLIS degree at Dalhousie and a PhD at Aberystwyth in Wales. Her primary research interests involved the pleasure reading habits of various groups with a particular focus on youth. In her doctoral research, Dr. Howard analyzed the role of pleasure reading and the public library in the lives of young teens to explore the key barriers and motivators underlying both pleasure reading and public library use for this age group. Currently, she is working on a funded research project that involves the creation of an informational portal devoted to Atlantic Canadian authors and illustrators of books for children and teens. Dr. Howard's research interests are mirrored in her teaching in the School of Information Management, in that she teaches elective classes on services and resources for children and teens, as well as a course on reading and reading practices. She is Associate Dean Academic in the Faculty of Management, reflecting her strong interest in management practice and theory. Related to this area, Dr. Howard also teaches organizational management and strategy and management without borders. Dr. Howard's academic record boasts several publications, honors, and awards, including a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada research grant, an Eileen Wallace Fellowship and a Francis Russell Award for her studies in Atlantic Canadian children's literature, a Teaching Excellence Award in Management Education, and an Emerald Literati Award for Excellence Outstanding Paper Award. We are excited to hear what she'll be presenting to us today, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Howard to speak about connecting authors and readers, researching and documenting Atlantic Canada books for youth.
Well, thank you. After that introduction, I'm excited to hear what I have to say myself. I can hardly wait. Now, what I am going to be talking about in the next hour is actually 3 different conference papers, and you win a prize if you can identify when one paper begins or ends and the next one begins. It is going to be a fairly quick overview of sort of the origin and the genesis of this project. What I really want to focus on is some of my current research, actually doing some analysis of Atlantic Canadian books for youth. So what what I'll be talking about is just really giving a little bit of context, why regional literature is important, and sort of teasing out some of the questions around that sort of really fundamental issue, and why a resource devoted to Atlantic Canadian books for children and teens is needed, is a useful and necessary resource. I'll talk a little bit about the project that I've been working on for the past 3 years, the CSTAX research project. And then what I really want to focus on is how this resource, how this website can be used as a research tool. And I'll talk about some of the research that some of my colleagues are doing, and then I'll talk in a bit more detail about my current research, which is looking at depictions of the Black Nova Scotian community in picture books. So the first question, and it really is the basic question that my research colleagues and I sort of sat around and debated before we began this project, and that is really the fundamental question, is it important for youth to read local books? I grew up in Vancouver in the 60s and 70s. I never read a book that was set in the place I lived. The first book that I read that was set on the west coast of Canada, I read when I was, I think, in first year university. But growing up, it didn't exist. There were no local books that I read. So, is it important? And if we define local, really broadly, books written by local authors, local illustrators, published by local publishers, or set in this region, is it important, and why or why not? What's the value of reading local books, especially for young readers, for children, young teens? Any thoughts? Any ideas? Yep.
Helps them build a sense of identity.
Right. So in terms of identity building, absolutely. I can remember, reading. I because of, I guess, my family's predilection, I read mostly British children's books, and I can remember, trying to speak with a British accent and wishing I lived in a boarding school, and sort of going through that. It never occurred to me that my own place was interesting and that had its own unique identity. So yeah, building that sense of pride and identity in where you live. There are other reasons why it's it's useful, good, positive, yeah.
It might encourage someone to read that wouldn't necessarily be a family reading, so if they can relate to their home,
Mm-hmm.
then that might be a great way to get them involved.
Right, and people read for different reasons, and some people read because they want to read about someplace exotic and different. Other people really like to read about what they know, and books that are set in their own location. Now that can be a really good motivator. Yep, Tara?
If you're reading a local author, you might actually have a chance to connect with them.
Right, to meet that person, which is, really compelling. I mean, in the Maritimes, there's, we have such a thriving community of authors and illustrators, and they're very active in visiting schools. So if you read those books and you actually have a chance to interact with that individual, that can be a really strong motivator as well, and really powerful experience. Any other reasons? Those are great ones. Yeah?
Actually, speaking of boarding schools, I had the opposite experience in a former colonial where the books that were written about your country were not written by, they were written by the colonizers rather than the people who lived there. So the perspective was rather different.
Right.
And that was often my background lacking. You get an outsider's perspective of your country that's actually not reflective of reality.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing that's really,
Yeah.
it's quite important.
Right, so that local perspective of what it's really like to live in that
But it's
environment.
also, it's also different interpretations in relation to social mores.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't get from the outside perspective.
Right, so that can be very different, and the life in different regions is, there are different cultures, different values, different activities that, may not be as accurately represented if they're written about by somebody from the outside. Any other reasons why it's good? Mm-hmm.
Well, it might inspire some of the local youth to become authors or illustrators themselves if they know that someone from the region was able to do it.
Right, that it becomes possible. If somebody who's, potentially a neighbor or someone who lives from the same background as you can do this, then, it becomes something that is an achievable goal. Absolutely. Any other reasons? And there's one, I guess, that no one's mentioned that's a little bit more pragmatic, and that is just simply supporting our local writers and illustrators and publishers, that there's an economic reason for also supporting, local publishing. So, there's all sorts of, of reasons, I think, why it is a good thing for youth to read local books. And around, probably about a decade ago, around the time that school libraries stopped having school librarians and school librarians started to decline in number, there were a couple of studies looking at the use of local books, Canadian books, in Canadian schools, and some fairly disturbing findings around that time. In 2001, a research team from Alberta found that most elementary school teachers were unfamiliar with contemporary Canadian books. And the next year, another study, a cross-Canada study, found that most Canadian high school students don't study Canadian books in their high school literature classes, and that school libraries have inadequate collections of Canadian materials, and concluded that teachers and administrators don't have the time or the budgets to search out these Canadian materials, and there are not enough appropriate guides to the literature or selection tools to either Canadian literature in general or regional literature. So these were a couple of studies that suggested that with the decline in the number of school librarians, that schools and teachers might not be incorporating these resources into their school libraries and classrooms. And so this prompted me to do a study back in 2009 to find out what was happening in the Atlantic provinces. So I did an online survey using Opinio of all public schools K-12 in the 4 Atlantic provinces. And what I found was really dramatic in the responses that I got from teachers, in that 95% of the teachers who responded said that theoretically they absolutely thought it was important to include regional authors and illustrators in their classrooms. They said, absolutely, it's something I want to do. It's theoretically something that I think is very valuable and important. Slightly less than half indicated that they'd actually done so. So less than half had actually used a regional book in any of their classes in the previous year. and just under 20% said that they felt well informed about regional books. So it really was pretty dramatic, and this isn't the best infographic, but it really dramatically shows huge agreement that it's desirable. About half of them are actually doing it, and a minority feel comfortable and confident that that they were even able to identify some regional authors. I mean, most people could identify Sherry Fitch and Budge Wilson, but beyond that, it became kind of gray and waffly, and some people thought, was Robert Munch an Atlantic Canadian author? Not too sure. So, I mean, there was a lot of uncertainty about who actually was from the region and what books were written from the region. And these are just some comments from teachers, which really reflect some of the ideas that you were suggesting about the value of regional books. It's important for children to see that there are people in their own geographic area that write, illustrate, and publish literature. This encourages young people to think of this as a profession. Children need to see connections of where they live to the rest of the world. Sometimes they know more about other places, and that was my experience. Several teachers commented on the need for a resource. One person said, I'd love to have a list of local authors on a reference website I could go to search for books related to what I'm teaching at a given time. I'm teaching a unit on agriculture. What books have been written about farming in the Maritimes? I don't know how to find those. At the moment, I don't know who the authors and illustrators are, what their books are called. I would have to do research to find out, and I just don't have the time. Another comment, I know very few Atlantic Canadian children's authors, and I'm very big on children's literature. How can Atlantic literature for young children be better promoted? So, several comments suggesting that a resource would be really useful. Now, it's not that there is no information available, because there is. There's lots of places that teachers, parents, young children themselves could go to find information. The Canadian Children's Book Centre has profile pages on authors, so if you know a particular author, you can go there to look up that individual and what they've published. PICA, the Canadian Children's Literature Database at Library and Archives Canada, has bibliographic information on Canadian children's books. If an author or illustrator is a member of CANSCAPE, the Canadian Society for Children's Authors, Illustrators, and Performers, then they will have an entry page with a list of their publications, which may or may not be entirely up to date. Portalan is a RefWorks database covering the Eileen Wallace Atlantic Canadian Children's Literature Collection at the University of New Brunswick, and it is a very good resource for all materials that are in that collection, but it's not a completely exhaustive collection. The various provinces have their own writers' federations, and so if an author or an illustrator is a member of that federation, there'd be information there, and many authors and illustrators have their own personal websites. But it's a typical information management problem. These resources provide information that's scattered, it's not organized consistently, it's not necessarily up to date, it's not necessarily authoritative. Some, for example, of the provincial writers' federations have very promotional material on their website. It's not really critical or objective information about authors and their work. So it really did seem, when we did our scan, that there was a need for a single, easy-to-use, authoritative online resource. So that led, ta-da, to the creation of CSTAX, which is the project that my colleagues and I have been working on for the past 3 years. And it was funded, as Janaea mentioned, by grants from SHIRC, from the Eileen Wallace Fellowship. Dalhousie University gave me some money in the form of a research development fund. IBI Canada also provided money in the Francis Russell Grant. Our team consisted of myself, my colleague Andrea Schwenk-Wiley at Acadia, Sue Fisher, who is the curator of the Eileen Wallace collection at UNB, and Keith Lawson, a familiar name to you all. And we had a variety of research assistants at Dalhousie, at Acadia, and at UNB, and currently Karen Vermeulen and Danielle Hubbard have been working with me on the project. So what CSTAX is, or at least sets out to be, is basically a one-stop shop for Atlantic Canadian children's books, or books for children and youth. It sets out to be an authoritative web-based resource where either teachers, parents, researchers, or even young people themselves could go to find information. And we set parameters, date parameters around CSTAC's 1978. That was the year of the publication of really the first modern Atlantic Canadian book, Holdfast by Kevin Major, was in 1978, and we ended it in 2011, which is when our money ran out. So the objectives of the first phase of the project are here. We're hoping to continue with it, but for the first phase, that's what we set out to do, to provide a resource that really highlighted authors, illustrators, themes in the regional literature. And to do that, in the first phase of the project, we set out to provide 25 profiles of authors or illustrators from the region. So we chose 6 from New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Prince Edward Island, and 7 from Nova Scotia. And what we have provided for each of those individuals' profiles are annotated bibliographies of their primary works, bibliographies of secondary works, works of criticism. There's a biographical profile, lists of awards and honors, and for these group of 6 authors and illustrators, videotaped interviews as well. Right now, Budge Wilson and Sherry Fitch interviews are the only 2 that are actually uploaded to the site, but we have completed this winter interviews with Shanti Grant, Susan Took, Anne Louise McDonald, and Vicki Grant, and those will be uploaded in the next couple of weeks. They're not on the site quite yet. In fact, we just finished, Danielle and I just interviewed Anne Louise McDonald last week during the study break. So when you go to the site, this is what you see if you go to an author page. This is the page for Janet McNaughton, the Newfoundland fantasy, well, she writes fantasy, she writes picture books, she's very versatile. But I know it's kind of small and hard to read, but I wanted to fit it all on the page. But there is a brief biographical sketch, an indication of where she lives, the locations that are associated with her writing, a bibliography of her works for children, and a link to her own personal website and her photograph. Now, if you click on any of those titles, you're taken to a book page. And this is a typical book page. This is the one for her work, Dragon Seer. There's the bibliographic information, and then descriptors. In this case, the descriptors are death, fantasy, folklore, history, love, and magic. If you click on any one of those descriptors, CSTACS pulls together all the other regional books that are on that particular theme that we have in our database. There's an overview, which is an original overview. All the research assistants who've been working on the project have actually read all of the books and have provided original overviews. They provided selected quotes to give a feel for what the book reads like, what its reading level is, what the flavor of the writing is, an indication of the key themes in the book, and a brief analysis. There's also citations to works of criticism and reviews, and an indication of any awards that the book has won. And this one was a finalist in the TV Children's Literature Award. So for each of the books, then for each author, there's quite a bit of information provided. Now, we're not done with the project. We're done with our money, unfortunately, but we're not completely finished with the project. So we do want to carry forward with this. And some of the things that we're thinking of is providing a more child-friendly interface. So the current interface is fine for older teens, but maybe something a little bit more youthful for younger children. We definitely want to continue doing the video recorded interviews with authors and illustrators, because those are really, really fascinating and get a lot of really, really interesting themes and ideas about the importance of regional literature to the actual creators. And we'd like to expand the focus of the site to include more information about print culture, so information about publishers and bookstores and even librarians in the region that have played a pivotal role in promoting regional books for youth. I did write an article on the evolution of the CSTACS project that was published in Partnerships last year, so if you're interested, you can read more about how this came together. Now, one of the things that we really wanted to create CSTAX for was as a research tool for scholars who are interested in doing more research on Atlantic Canadian children's books, because scholarship on this region's children's books is almost non-existent. And for anybody who's interested in doing some original research on Atlantic Canadian children's books, it is really a wide open sea. You know, there's very, very little that's been done. I was really excited a couple of years ago when Gail Edwards and Judith Saltman published their book, Picturing Canada, A History of Canadian Children's Illustrated Books and Publishing. It's an absolutely wonderful resource, fascinating book. Atlantic Canada is invisible. It's not in here at all. So there's really almost nothing has been done on either the authors, the illustrators, or the history of publishing in the region. And CSTAX allows scholars, as well as teachers, parents, kids, to gather books together in ways they may not have done before. So by clicking on the themes or the descriptors, you can gather together a collection of regional books on a topic and use that as a starting point for a research project. Now, often when you think about the history of Atlantic Canadian writing for children, everybody thinks of Anne of Green Gables as kind of the starting point. But actually, the first regional children's book was published in 1846, a long, long time ago. It was called Little Grace, or Scenes in Nova Scotia. I've never read it. It is in the Eileen Wallace collection, though, and one day I will read it. But picture books from the region are much more recent, and my own recent research has been looking at picture books, and they did not begin in the region until quite late. Regional publishing in Canada as a whole began to flourish in the 1970s as part of sort of a aftermath of Expo 67 and flourishing of Canadian pride and nationalism, but also our Royal Commission on Book Publishing recommended the establishment of sort of decentralized networks of regional publishers. Canada Council started to provide grants for regional publishers, and there was further financial support given by the Canadian Book Publishing Development Program, and this really encouraged the development of regional presses. So in Atlantic Canada, some of the early presses that were that arose during this period, during the 1970s, were Brunswick Press in New Brunswick, Breakwater Books in Newfoundland, Ragweed in PEI, and Nimbus in Nova Scotia. And they all published picture books in the early days. Now, the very first true picture books from the Atlantic region were published in 1979. It was a pair of companion books, both with poetry by Lance Wooliver and paintings as illustrations, original paintings by Maud Lewis. Now, Maud Lewis died in 1970, so she was already not there by 1979, but what Lance Wooliver did was take a series of her paintings and essentially craft a poem that went with the paintings and that kind of told a story that linked the paintings together. And these two books were From Ben Lomond to the Sea and Christmas with the Rural Mail. And many of you are probably very familiar with what Maud Lewis's paintings look like. I've been rereading Ian McKay's work, Quest for the Folk, and I brought in my copy just so I could remember the entire subtitle. Quest of the Folk, Anti-Modernism and Cultural Selection in 20th Century Nova Scotia. And in this work, McKay makes a really interesting argument about the way Nova Scotia was constructed as this kind of folk culture with a great emphasis on folklore and handicrafts, and really not a modern society, really de-emphasizing urbanization, cultural diversity, emancipation of women, that all those really modern features of the province were downplayed and the more folkloric Celtic aspects were upplayed. So a quote from McKay's work, from the 1920s on, across one cultural field after another, the American and British markets indicated an overwhelming preference for romantic tales of the sea, portrayals of salt-of-the-earth folk living quiet lives in traditional peasant villages and nostalgic images of the golden age. It's the way we all live, right? This is exactly our life. But when you look at these images, and these are from a book that was published, remember, in 1979, it's exactly the kind of images you get. They're the traditional Maud Lewis images. There's nothing here to suggest that these were written in a modern age, 1979. There's the ox cart. There's the Cape Islander and the schooner off in the background. Pictures of the mail being delivered by sleigh, and the farmer. No tractor in sight. Just him and his animals. Now, Herb Wiley, who is an English professor at Acadia University, wrote a book a couple of years ago with one of the best titles ever, Anne of Tim Hortons, Globalization and the Reshaping of Atlantic Canadian Literature. And this is the title, showing the shock of red hair. And he kind of took Ian McKay's argument and carried it into the 21st century and said, really, what McKay was arguing has not changed all that much in contemporary Atlantic literature. Wiley says, the culture and environment of the Atlantic provinces have been constructed for over a century as a restorative antidote to the alienating inauthenticity of a dog-eat-dog, technologized modern society, and the marketing of the region as such continues apace. One of the paradoxes that McKay highlights is the way that host societies are complicit in the perpetration of and often internalize touristic constructions of their own cultures. And so we kind of took these ideas and looked a little bit at more recent Atlantic Canadian picture books. Is this image of this sort of golden age, this very anti-modern or unmodern Atlantic region, is it reflected in some of the images that we get in more recent Atlantic Canadian picture books? And I just am including really the tip of the iceberg in some of the images that I'm going to show you. I could have included probably 10 times more, but in the interest of brevity, I'm just including one example from each of the Atlantic or each of the maritime provinces. This is from a book published in PEI by Ragweed in 1987 called Lobster in My Pocket by Deirdre Kessler. And it tells the story of a lonely girl growing up in a fishing village in Prince Edward Island. She's very lonesome, she's very shy, she has no friends, and then one day she meets a talking lobster who lives in her pocket. I don't know if you can actually see, but she does actually have the talking lobster in her pocket. So just take a look at some of the images in the cover. I'll show you a couple of other images, see if you can identify some of the common themes. This is a book from New Brunswick author-illustrator Heidi Jardine Stoddart, East to the Sea, which tells the story of a family from Ontario who come to New Brunswick to visit the grandfather and the holiday that they have on the way. And this is a picture of the family at the beach. They come back 3 years later, do a similar road trip from Ontario to New Brunswick. This time they go to Nova Scotia en route, and this is a picture of Peggys Cove. And then I've got a couple of examples from Susan Took's work, some of her earlier works. This is from her book, I'll just pass that around, Full Moon Rising, which tells the story of a farm family in Nova Scotia going through sort of the cycles of the moon. This is one image of Wash Day. This is a country wedding in Full Moon Rising. And another of Susan Took's earlier works, A Fiddle for Angus, I'll start out on this side, tells the story of a little boy and his fiddle. And this is an image from Fiddle for Angus. It shows actually Natalie McMaster playing the fiddle and people having a fine time. And there's another image from Fiddle for Angus. So any thoughts on some of the images of the region that you find in more recent picture books? Any observations about how we're being portrayed? Yep.
Since I'm from Ontario, it's kind of interesting to see
That's exactly the way it is. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And just one word, coastal.
Just one word, coastal. Yeah. There's very little to show that this, that anything modern happens here. There's no cities anywhere. There's no cars. There's, yeah.
I wonder though, as one of those nasty Ontarians, if you could argue that perhaps the focus of these books is because everyone has cities. There's nothing unique about cities, so
Yeah.
perhaps put a positive spin and show that these are characteristics of Atlantic Canada that you might not find other places.
Elsewhere.
So maybe, but if that's all that we're showing, that's the problem.
Up until now, this has been pretty much it. There have been no picture books showing Halifax. Other than, there's some alphabet books that do, C is for Citadel, and there's a picture of the Citadel. But in terms of actual picture books that have a narrative, they're not there. Yeah.
It's beyond the scope of this, but it's not exclusive to picture books either at all.
No.
I mean, if you look at Newfoundland tourism ads, it works for us.
Yep, exactly.
There's
Yes.
also, a fishing village.
Yeah.
It doesn't bother me. I mean, I'm from Newfoundland too, and I like seeing all that sort of stuff. It reminds me of home, so
Yeah.
when the ads get me, I burst into tears every time.
Yeah, they're very sentimental, right? And I mean, and this is very much the same. Yeah.
But I mean, I like it, and I mean, I guess for someone who's coming from away, they can kind of be confused by the fact that there's cities and whatnot. But for someone who grew up in the city of Atlantic Canada, I liked seeing that because it reminded me of my grandparents.
Yes.
Because that's what I saw when I went around the bay and visited with them.
Yeah. And I mean, I am totally guilty of this too, because when I moved to Nova Scotia from Vancouver, the first thing that my husband and I did was go and find a fishing village and, move there because, my God, it's so quaint and it's so pretty. And it's so Nova Scotian. But, I mean, it is very interesting to see the way these images keep getting replicated. So what you see in most picture books about the region is, these rural seaside landscapes, images of farmers and fisher folk, this rock-bound coastline, so these very almost cliche images. And maybe a more disturbing lack is the lack of diversity. That there's no cities clearly anywhere in the Atlantic region. Everyone appears to be white and Celtic. We're all singing and dancing to fiddles all the time. I mean, it is these sort of stereotypes that are out there, which is fine as long as there's a balance. But in the balance is a little bit extreme in the direction of these kind of saccharine images of the Maritimes. So what we get are books that are geographically centered, and there's lots of geographic markers like Peggys Cove and the coastline, but they're ahistorical. And the one that really is a great example of that is Full Moon Rising, where those people could be living any time from the 1920s up to the 21st century. That book the paintings that were created for that book were painted in the year 2000, but they look like they were, looking back to maybe the 1920s or 30s. There's no real sign of modernity in that book. And they're very nostalgic. They're sort of sentimental, nostalgic portraits of the place, which is fine. But, there perhaps should be a bit more balanced. Yeah?
Is it, as another equalitarian, is that necessarily such a bad thing to have a signifier of something that it does come from that place? Because I don't know what a book about Ontario would look like, unless it was someone in a car driving to work. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
Ontario.
Yeah.
Northern Ontario, snowshoes, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the Maritimes has a character that is lacking in certain regions
Absolutely.
of Canada. That I think it might be more of a product of that than
And also it's what, and you hate to be crass, but it is what the market wants, right? The market wants these images of the region, and that's what, marks these books as from this region and, gives them that little bit of maritime flavor. So, it's an interesting question. Yeah?
That raises the question, so I mean, it's in the point of Captain, that are these books they're written by local authors? Are they being written for a local audience, or are they marketing outside of Nova Scotia? Because if you you're marketing internally, you think, we should know that that's not actually the reality. So the target audience, I'm wondering how much that plays into it.
Yeah, well, they're both. I think they're marketed very heavily for tourists who come here and buy these books as tourist books that they then take home with them. So, you go into, Woozles, for example, in the summertime when the cruise ships are here, they have big displays of these books, and they are purchased as tourist books that people take away with them. Yep.
Have you noticed a difference in the books that have been published in the last couple of years?
We're just going to look at some of those. So, great question. Yeah.
Just like Lisa Moore is a new Lancaster, and she's really captivated the way that St. John's is now in a lot of her books. But the reality is, like, when I went to school, like, we're 99% white. We still are. I went to school with one brown kid.
Yeah.
So a book that has all white people is actually correct for the way even still it is now at home.
Yeah.
So it's really not that off.
No.
Because we are kind of behind in some ways.
And yeah, it's not I mean, levels of multiculturalism in the Atlantic region are much less than other regions, but it's not, I mean, there still is multiculturalism here. We're not all,
yes,
white Celtic.
But like in a book portraying Newfoundland and whatnot, I mean, it would be inaccurate to have a multitude of ethnicities because someone would come and expect that. Like, it wasn't until, I mean, my mom's from the mainland, and it wasn't until I went up to the mainland that I even saw someone who looked different. Because that's not the way it was.
Yeah. So it is quite interesting to look at, to look with an eye, sort of thinking about some of the themes that Ian McKay talks about in his book and that Herb Wiley talked about in his book, about the portrayal of the region in, picture books over about the past decade. And so, my research colleagues and I gave a panel at a Children's Literature Association conference in Boston last summer. And we talked about, in these books, the parallel between the adult view of childhood and images of Nova Scotia. And I think it's maybe one of the reasons why some of these picture books about Nova Scotia have been so successful and so popular, is there is really this sort of union of our nostalgic images of what childhood is like and our nostalgic images of what the Maritimes are like. This sense of innocence. And a couple of quotes from McKay where he talks about Nova Scotia's heart, its true essence resides in the primitive, the rustic, the unspoiled, the picturesque, the quaint, the unchanging. Nova Scotia is to be defined more and more unequivocally as a therapeutic space removed from the stress and difficulties of modern life, just as childhood is kind of that safe, protected space removed from the stress and difficulties of adult life. So I think that's one of it's like an equation of the childhood experience with the maritime experience. And these picture books, especially the two that I'm circulating, have been really successful and really, really popular, I think, because of the way childhood and the Maritimes are portrayed. Now, some of my research colleagues are doing various studies using the site for sort of more critical analysis of some of these books. One of my colleagues is doing a study of regional representations in Atlantic Canadian alphabet books, finding some very interesting observations. Some picture books have I is for Irving, for example, and some of the observations about M is for McCain. And ideology in Atlantic Canadian nonfiction for children, and representations of place in Atlantic Canadian picture books of the 1990s, sort of doing a more broad analysis of picture books for the last decade. Now, my current research is looking at images of the Black Nova Scotian community. And what is actually very interesting to me, because I read in Judy Saltman and Gail Edwards' book about the history of illustrated books in Canada, the early start of multicultural picture books. I mean, really going back to the 1970s is when the first multicultural picture books began in Canada. And we've had about 40 years of picture books in most regions of the country portraying different diverse communities. The Black Nova Scotian community has not been portrayed in picture books from Nova Scotia until 2008. That was the first. Even though the Black Nova Scotian community dates back to the 18th century. So there's been a conspicuous absence. So I looked at the only 3 examples that existed up until this year. There's been a 4th book that's been published this year. 2 are by the collaboration of spoken word poet Shanti Grant and illustrated by Susan Tooke, and those are Up Home and The City Speaks in Drums. Then a 3rd book, Viola Desmond, Won't Be Budged, also published in 2010. And there's a 4th book that was published just this year, which isn't included in what I've been looking at. Apples and Butterflies, also written by Shanti Grant, but illustrated by Tamara Piccolo. And I've written a paper on this that hasn't been published yet, but is forthcoming in Bookbird in the fall. Now, just quickly, and I know most of you know quite a bit, or at least something about the Black Nova Scotian community, especially since we're just coming to the end of Black History Month. Basically, there are 3 waves of migration of blacks into Nova Scotia, beginning in the 1780s, right after the American Revolution. Then, around 1796, there was a deportation of Maroons to Nova Scotia. These individuals helped build the Halifax Citadel. And then after the War of 1812, there was a 3rd wave of migration. And at this time, land was gifted to the black community in North Preston, making it the largest black community in Canada, and settlements were established in other locations as well. And Black Nova Scotians are the largest visible minority in the province. They make up half of all visible minority residents of Nova Scotia. Half belong to the Black Nova Scotian community, and yet they've never been portrayed up until 2008. Now, in their history of illustrated books in Canada for children, Edwards and Saltman devote a chapter to multicultural books. And they observe that almost all Canadian picture books pretty much support the notion of multiculturalism as kind of one of the things that makes Canada different, as an unproblematic social good in which intercultural tensions, if they exist at all, are resolved by the majority being tolerant of minority groups. In none of the picture books that they examined was there any significant shifting of power relations, and basically the theme that's repeated again and again in these picture books is that members of diverse communities are integrated into the larger social fabric, into the vertical mosaic, preserving the myth of Canada as an inclusive society where racism doesn't really exist. So I was interested to see if that was also true for the books about the Black Nova Scotian community, which in many ways has been, a long history and not always a very smooth history. Now, in my analysis, I used 2 theoretical frameworks. One is the CounterStory, where essentially you take a myth and analyze it to see if or to look at the story through the lens of the CounterStory to see if basically the story is replicating the myth or is kind of inverting it and giving a different version or a different perspective on something that we accept as a given. I also use the framework of home and away, which is something that Mavis Reimer really developed in her analysis, but Louise Saldana has used to look at multicultural books. So it takes the image of home, what is home, and many Canadian children's books are about, the establishment of a new home in Canada. Is home the multicultural community? Is it the Canadian mainstream? And Louise Saldana notes that most multicultural visible minority Canadians represent, to mainstream Canadians, away. They're sort of foreign, they're exotic, they don't represent the mainstream. Well, in a community that's as old as the Black Nova Scotian community, is that community home? Is it an exotic away? And does it depend on the perspective? So I just very quickly, because I know I've only got about 10 minutes left, wanted to look at some of the picture books that I've been looking at. So Up Home, and I'm going to start with a brief clip from the interview with Shanti Grant that we did about a month ago.
You need to plug this out.
It is plugged in,
yes,
yeah,
yes,
so
yes.
hopefully it will be okay. And this is in the meeting room in Sim when it finally comes on.
I guess as an artist, I first, spoken word, I guess, would be my roots in terms of poetry and performing, and have been doing that for a number of years, just being on stage and going to events and sharing my poems out loud. My first children's book is Up Home, and that actually came about because I was invited to perform at an event organized by the Writers' Federation of Nova Scotia. It was their annual gala, and I read that poem, and Sandra McIntyre, who was the editor of Nimbus Publishing at the time, was in the audience. And she came up to me after and she said, you know what, that poem you just read would make a pretty cool kids book. So from that, it just sort of snowballed from there. I guess I always felt that eventually I might write books, but with sort of having so much as a spoken word artist, it never really seemed like an immediate thing that I was going to do. But having that opportunity to do the first book, it just kind of, I think, opened my eyes to this whole other way of I guess, channeling that side of my art, and it's been really great.
Okay, so I'll just pass around a poem, which tells the story of Shanti Grant's childhood. Essentially, she was born in North Preston, moved to Halifax when she was 3, and this book takes the perspective of her as an adult, and it begins, I remember, and then remembers back to her Sunday afternoons going back to North Preston, visiting members of her extended family. So I'll just show you a couple of images from the book. This is an image of a church supper. Various members of the community gathered around, eating and drinking and having freezies, playing hide and go seek outside, the ubiquitous coastline. You get it in the background in that one. And this, one of my favorite images from the book, shows Shanti Grant's grandmother, and the cover of the book, as if you look at it, it actually has an image that's like a quilt. There's a little girl kind of hovering over the community, and there's it sort of blends, the landscape sort of blends into this image of a quilt. And this is the grandmother's storytelling quilt, and here she is telling her grandchildren the story of the black immigration to Nova Scotia. And the book ends with really an expression of love and devotion and dedication and rootedness to this community of Preston. Let's just see if I can very, very quickly get that. This only takes a minute.
At the end of Up Home, there's a bit of a historic piece about the community of North Preston and also the history of the migration of blacks to Nova Scotia, which is a very, rich and old history, and a lot of people don't know, especially around the country, and that we have some communities here that go back more than 200 years, some rural black communities, and putting that piece at the end was really important to me, to be able to say we are here in that way, and. And the other thing was just documenting the community through words, through pictures, and in that respect, I think, collaborating with Susan was really ideal, just again, because of the time she took and the care she took to come out to the community on a regular basis to meet with people and to really, document the faces and the people there.
So this book I thought was really an interesting portrait of the black community in North Preston, because it seems to me it's doing two things. It's kind of normalizing the childhood experiences of Shanti Grant, because everyone has had those experiences of going to visit their grandparents, going to church suppers, playing hide and seek, doing those really common childhood things. And yet there's a very specific detail about life in North Preston. It's depicted pretty much as a monoculture. There's no white faces portrayed in the book at all. They're portraits of individuals. Clearly, these are unique people that are portrayed in the book. And the language of the book is the sort of spoken word style that Shanti Grant uses. So it's an interesting meaning of home in Up Home, that North Preston was the first home of the black loyalists. It was the first black community in Canada. And clearly it's home, a very important home for the narrator, but, you know, for people outside that community, you know, it is clearly away, it's distant, it's unfamiliar. Very quickly, I'll just show you City Speaks in Drums, which is a very different book. And this one is the first depiction of downtown Halifax in a picture book. It's much different in feel from a poem, much more contemporary, much more urban, shows an integrated Halifax. Begins with two little boys at the George Dixon Center. They start out playing basketball, but very quickly it becomes a game of water guns, and they're shooting each other with water guns. And, you know, the images, I'm not going to try reading this, but running up and down the block with water pistols round, drenching each other up to their necks. Trigger release them water jets. And so they leave this water gun fight and start on a journey throughout the city. So here we see modern North End Halifax. There's a bus. And the boys are moving throughout the city, and you see very, you know, easily identified landmarks on the way. So they take off, they go down Gottingen Street, they enter into the south end of the city, they hear music everywhere they go. So they meet, for example, outside the public library, the old public library, there's a djembe drummer with dreadlocks, and he's playing the drums. Outside the Economy Shoe Store, there's the obligatory Celtic fiddler. They meet flamenco dancers. They meet a guy that's playing the spoons outside the public library. They're moving throughout the city, and there's music everywhere they go. So, you know, the question that I ask in the paper that I wrote about this book is, you know, are these boys at home in Halifax? And it's kind of a ambiguous answer, I would say, because the boys never go in anywhere. Everywhere they go, they're outside. Even the public gardens and the public library, they're on the street. You never see them entering a store, entering into, you know, any gates. They're always on the outside. And, you know, they're participating in what seems to be almost like a little multicultural music festival, but they're not really engaged in any other way in the life of the city. The third book that I look at, and I don't have my own copy of that one, is Viola Desmond, Won't Be Budged by Richard Rudnicki, text by Jody Nyasha Warner. And this story is probably familiar to most of you. 1946, Viola Desmond was a very successful black entrepreneur. She owned a series of hair salons in North End Halifax and also throughout the province. One day, there's a picture of her in her hair salon, and one day she set out on a road trip to go to Cape Breton, where she had a series of salons in Cape Breton as well. On her way, her car broke down in New Glasgow, and while her car was being repaired, she went to the movie theater. It was a segregated movie theater. Tickets for blacks cost 1 penny less, and she was supposed to sit in the balcony. She was short-sighted, so she sat in the main floor of the theater. Usher came along and tried to get her to move or leave. She refused. She was arrested, thrown in jail, and fined for tax evasion for the sake of a 1 penny difference in her theater ticket. What's really interesting about this book, I found, was the use of color, the yellow spotlight that always shines on Viola. She's always shown dressed in green. And this very theatrical quality where the members of the audience are looking on, kind of watching this little play that's taking place between Viola and the usher. Image of Viola sitting in jail. She appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, where once again she was found guilty of tax evasion and fined for court costs. But the book ends, Viola's bravery made a big difference. She inspired all kinds of people to fight against segregation. You know, some people see her as being like the precursor to Rosa Parks. She predated Rosa Parks by about 8 years. By the late 1950s, it was made against the law. So the book ends, come on, join me in saying thank you to Viola Desmond. So I think these are really interesting books in the way they portray the Black Nova Scotian community. Edwards and Saltman note how important picture books can be in giving cultural information about identity, about the landscape and the region and the definitions of community. So some of my conclusions in the remaining minute that I have. Multicultural picture books have been incredibly slow to appear in Nova Scotia, 2008 being the first one. But I think they're really interesting examples. that they begin, I think a poem is quite a nostalgic, romantic view of the Black community. I think it's very much in the tradition of some of those other books that we were looking at. But definitely City Speaks in Drums and Viola Desmond, more complex images. Definitely more direct questions about community and power and prejudice and equality in contemporary Nova Scotia. So I think, what we get in these books is a celebration of the internal strength of the Black Nova Scotian community, and also, clear references to the isolation and discrimination that this community has experienced. So in that regard, I think they're really very interesting examples. Slow to arrive, but now that they're here, hopefully just marking the beginning of an emergence of some new voices in Nova Scotia picture books. It. And I'm sorry, I did not leave time for questions, and I apologize for that.
Well, we do have a few minutes, so we're going to be pushed out of this room. That's why I'm just stepping to move quickly here. So are there one or two questions for, or maybe one question? I know have our thanks and we'll need to actually move on. So questions? Yes. So.
How did you go about identifying all of these authors?
How do we go about? That's a great question.
Beyond all of those verses that you named, must be kind of a little bit of word of mouth.
The way we identified the authors that we profiled, we tried to get a mix. So we included, established figures like Fudge Wilson and Sherry Fitch, but we also wanted to include new and emerging individuals. We have Troy Little, who's a graphic novelist from, Prince Edward Island, and we also wanted to include, wherever possible, diverse individuals. So, Shanti Grant, we had Meisel Joes, a Mi'kmaq from Newfoundland. So we did, as much as possible, try to include a diverse range, not just the big names.
Okay, I'm going to ask Leopoldo, who is also a student, to thank our speaker today, and I'm sure there'll be more questions. I'm just conscious that we're going to be pushed out of the room.
I know, I can see people lurking out there.
So, I'm sure if there are questions, we can defer them to outside the room.
Right.
We've done, but let's have Leah do our formal thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Howard, for your very interesting and informative lecture. As a student interested in the information needs of children, it was very interesting to learn about the importance of regional children's literature. So on behalf of the School of Information Management, I wish to present you with this gift in appreciation of your lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you.